Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be translation and what does it take to be an expert in the Torah. Now, as always, this comes from some kind of a response that I received from someone. And I'm kind of connecting two ideas here. And it's not just the issue of translation, but it's also the issue of being an expert in what the Torah has in it, what it says, and how to understand it. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to be doing a lot of this in English. There's not going to be a lot of Hebrew in this particular video. But I want to deal with the idea of translation because I've come across people who seem to have this idea in their head that because they read a translation of, or what they think is a translation of the Torah, the Tanakh, of any kind of Jewish text, that they somehow understand it either A, better than we Jews who know Hebrew and Aramaic, or B, that the translation is 100% gives them a complete accurate picture of what's actually happening in the text. Now the reality is anyone who's ever done translation knows that this is not true at all. So for example, Peter Newmark, I was looking through quotes, of translators, and he did a called Manual de Traducción, a textbook of translation, and I probably butchered the name of the text that he called it, but essentially says there's no such thing as a perfect, ideal, or correct translation. A translator is always trying to extend his knowledge and improve his means of expression. He's always pursuing facts and words. So further to that, there's also another article I found called No Translation is Perfect, Gain and Loss of Linguistic and Cultural Features that has a couple of points here. The basic assumptions of a layman concerning translation is that every word or meaning can universally be translated from one language to another. Then in the next part of the highlighted part, the paper at hand will refute this notion. It will prove and exemplify the fact that not everything is translatable, and that a transfer of meaning necessarily involves changes entailing loss or gain of linguistic, culture, and stylistic features. Further, he mentions translation cannot create an identical TL copy of the SL text, but only permits a relative equivalence to it. So I think that pretty much could be like, case closed at that point. But let's look at a few more ideas on this issue. An author by the name of Tomoko Inaba is translation a rewriting of an original text. So in her article, she mentions the following. The abstract basically mentions that, describes translation as rewriting of the original text. This paper will reevaluate Lafarin's concept of translation through examining my chosen text. So she mentions the following in this examination, and I'll go to the highlighted part. As a result, translations are rarely equivalent to the original. And this is like, her quoting Basnet, 1980, further argues that the translated texts are so far removed from the original that they need to be considered as independent products of literature. Further, she states, the target audience, which does not have the direct access to the original text, totally depends on the translation to gain an idea of the original work and its writer. And then she further mentions the translation is a text comprised of refractions, and it manipulates messages to project a certain image in the service of certain ideological constraints. According to Lafarve, this fact is apparent in the passages where translators insert in their translation passages that are most emphatically not in the original. Further, she mentions in the last part, Lafarve also points out that ideology functions as a tremendous constraint in the act of translation. And then lastly, as a part of her paper, what I found interesting is in her conclusion, she says, in this respect, the translator is a rewriter of the original text, as he or she engages in the act of cultural and identical transportation and distorts the ST to accommodate it with the TT. And these are all terms that they use for the translation, the text itself, and which one is the original versus which one is the translation. And further, she mentions, hence, rewriters, translators are, in some respects, traitors, since to a certain extent they violate the original, which they must do to remain within the boundaries of the target culture. Rewritings or translations are manipulation, since they reflect the rewriter's translator's efforts in adapting the text to function in a given society in a given way. Also, they may be controversial because they can create different values and practices. Now, as someone who uses, who attempts to try to translate certain texts within my videos, I can say that she's 100% correct. Because there are times that I try to say something in a video, thinking that I can maybe try to get the idea across, but I look at it and say, okay, wait a minute, that's not the best way to say that. And the only real way that I can try to convey the idea is to tell someone, you need to go learn the language. I mean, you essentially need to spend time learning the language. That doesn't mean that you take a course for a year and then you're done. This means that you spend a lifetime evaluating the language. And that's one of the things that we Torath Mosheh Jews do, that, over our lifetime, let's say someone is, keeps Torah, learns it at like 5, You don't stop analyzing the text or the text itself and the culture until you die. So let's say the person lives to 95. Essentially, that means that probably around 90 years are spent learning, relearning, arguing, debating, finding new information, reevaluating, evaluating, coming to conclusions, reworking those conclusions until the person passes away, essentially. And that's the work of a Jew who keeps Torah. Further to this, when dealing with what an expert translator is, basically dealing with an expert translator is fluent in both source and target language, and with a knowledge of the relevant field is necessary. A layman with no such expertise attempting to translate a text themselves would be foolish. Now, this is something that I got from, someone who was on a forum where they were trying to dispute what I'm saying essentially now. And they were saying, well, any translation can be used to understand the Torah. It doesn't really matter as long as an expert did it. And I said, well, I agree with that. But, the thing is, the person was like, well, how can you agree with me? You disagree. And I'm like, no, I don't disagree. We just have to define who's an expert and who's a layman. So one of the things I found interesting is there's basically a senior fellow emeritus of Kogan Research Center named Noam Zion in English. So he basically says, and I'll mainly quote the parts where I've highlighted. He says, the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew text of the Torah, the Nevi'im, the writings, is written in a particular style, and it is to a large extent the style itself in the original Hebrew that contained a great deal of the power of the text. He further goes on and says, if Hebrew is the language of study, then some teachers ask the students to translate the text in their own words, and they compare their efforts with alternative translations. Further, in fact, comparative translation can raise the student's awareness of the importance of learning biblical Hebrew. And then on the far right side, he says, there have been those who have realized that much of the message and the content of the text is actually contained in the form of the text, meaning that once you remove the Hebrew itself, you lose a lot of the context and the meaning of the text the minute you try to take it into another language, because even the writing itself, the way it's formulated in the scroll itself, is basically a part of the writing system. And this is true of anyone who's ever read a Sefer Torah, meaning a Torah scroll. You know that the text itself, the way it's written, the way it's spaced, is telling a story. Now, someone who doesn't know Hebrew would never see that, and if they read a translation, they would never even know it's there, because how would they? They have no connection to the actual original. So this is what I came up with, based upon, taking what, was said earlier. An expert translator, fluent in both source and target language, and with knowledge of the relevant field is necessary. And this is meaning that it's necessary for understanding the Torah correctly, because again, this is someone else's statement that I took and kind of, expanded upon it in a way that makes sense. And a layman with no such expertise attempting to translate a text themselves would be foolish. Now, the one thing I put in there was when I was responding to this person, I said, well, let me define what a layman is, because they did not define it where I am. According to Torath Mosheh, a layman with no such expertise is any one of the following. 1. Someone who does not know the oral Torah. So if you have a person who's, like, let's say, claimed to be a translator, does not know the oral Torah, then they are a layman. Someone who ignores Torath Mosheh sources from Mizrahi, Yemenite, North African, and Asian Jewish communities, scholars. Someone who has never read a Torah scroll with the proper nikudot and ta'amim. And again, if someone who doesn't know what that is, that means that, if someone is, you're reading, like, say, an article from a scholar and they never explain what those things are, then you could say that they're a layman, because they're not giving you the information that would progress you to the next level. 4, who cannot explain the practical application of mitzvot according to Torath Mosheh sources. So let's say you have a professor who knows ancient Hebrew, but can't explain to you the actual practical application of things that are written in the Hebrew text of the Torah. So let's say, for example, someone says Passover, Pesach, which is the Pesach, which is the original word. How did Jews do it? How did they do it 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago? How do they do it now? And a person says, I think they do A, B, C, and D, or I don't really know practically all of the ramifications of how they do it. Well, then you're a layman, because again, little kids who are Jewish can can tell you that information. Now, one of the things that has to be expressed about translation, because sometimes, especially people who are Christianized, bring up this idea that at one point as they say, the Bible was translated into Greek. And they say it was like the Septuagint. Now, the funny thing about that is in reality, if you look at the history, it wasn't the entire Tanakh. It was actually on the Torah, and the original text that was translated doesn't even exist anymore. It was actually destroyed, during the time that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed. And everything that's called a Septuagint now is simply a Christian translation produced by Christians, by people who weren't Jewish. Now, if you look in the Talmud, in Masechet Sofrim, Perek Aleph, Halacha Zayin, what it basically mentions is that I'll kind of just explain what this means here, is that when that text was actually written, it was not a good thing for the Jewish people, especially because of the fact that you can't really translate 100% correctly the Hebrew Torah, because you always lose something in the translation. I mean, the only real acceptable translations that have been accepted in the Jewish community are those in the Aramaic, because it's a really close language to Hebrew, and even our translations of it into Aramaic use the same script as the Hebrew text. So this is where this part of the Talmud says, "V'kasher liYisrael kiyom she'na'aseh ha'egel shelo hayta haTorah yochula letargem kol tzorcho." So basically, he was saying you can't fully translate the Torah like by all its needs. You lose something in the process, which is necessary for the Jewish people, which is why we spend so much time learning Torah. Further to this point, I found an interesting text called Mishnah Halachot, where in Siman Kuf Lamed He Kolo, he basically mentions that the halachic text should not be translated in English. There's different opinions on this, but the basic point that is made up in this halachic text is that if you start translating halachic text into English, it could be used by people who have like false intentions to try to like basically persecute the Jewish people, as well as it won't be fully understood because you can't fully translate it. So then this brings us to what exactly is the Torath Mosheh view of translation. So again, and I've covered this before, but let's go over it again. An expert translator, fluent in both source and target language, and with knowledge of the relevant field is necessary. And of course, as we said before, laymen with no such expertise attempting to translate a text themselves would be foolish. And this is again from someone else who I, broke down their statement. So according to Torath Mosheh, what is an expert translator? We'll answer that in just a second. According to Torath Mosheh, what does it mean to be fluent in both source and target language? According to Torath Mosheh, what does it mean to have knowledge of the relevant field is necessary? Relevant field is necessary. So let's deal with that. An expert translator would visually show these sources and their works and describe their history connection in detail. Now, what do I mean by that? I've seen a number of papers written about, like let's say, if you will, biblical text, ancient, semi-ancient and modern. And I've seen a number of them written in English, but they don't actually show you the text they're even talking about and break down where they're getting the information from. So for example, I've seen people claim that the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls are so different. But I've read both, and I'm like, well, that's not different. That's just like, a letter that didn't have to be there, and it's still the same pronunciation, and it says the same thing. But in an English version of the article, I've seen things where it's like, okay, what's so different? I'm like, well, where are the big differences? I don't see them in Hebrew. So essentially, a person who's trying to give you an accurate translation would be able to pull out a text that they're translating from and say, well, this is where I'm getting this information from. And that's what I try to do in my videos. And I know that for some people it's bothersome. I've come across a couple of people who are English speakers only, and they've said, oh, well, you have this Hebrew in your videos. It's so bothersome. And I'm like, well, that's the way I can show you that I know what I'm talking about, rather than just me saying things and not proving to you where I'm getting this information from. Because again, I've seen a lot of PhDs and scholars who simply just say, yeah, the text says this, and then they don't show you where it says that, especially for those of us who can read it for ourselves. I prefer to actually have the text in my hand and say, okay, well, this either says it or it doesn't say it. If it doesn't, then where are you getting this from? That's just your idea. Next, an expert translator is only fluent in both source and target language if they can show the reader that they know all these texts that you see here. So for example, I can tell you where these texts come from. I can tell you the top one, for example, is a scroll that, I think is almost about 1,300 years old. And it's of the Ashira. So then it's basically, I can read the top of it, as Yishir Moshe uvnei Yisrael at the Shira Zot Ladonoi Yomeru Lemor, and so on and so on. The middle one I can tell you is Masechet Avodah Zorah, from the Mishnah, Lifnei Adadahan, Shelo Goyim, Shelo Shah Yomim, so going on and on. The last one at the bottom is a Shomroni Torah, so which basically talks about Shabbat. So the thing is someone who's an expert in these areas can show you what they're talking about, where they're getting this information from. They'll show you the original text and be able to show you close up to where you can see it, and maybe one day you can learn it for yourself, and then you can also enjoy the ability to read it with them. And maybe in the areas where you can't see something very clearly, you don't really know what something says, you at least know, for example, like this at the bottom one, I don't read Samaritan every day, so I'm not like an expert in it, but I can read enough to know that, for example, this is Shmor et Yom HaShabbat, so I can read that. And I don't pronounce everything in Samaritan because I don't really have the pronunciation anymore. And I learned it at one point years ago, but I stopped using it. But, in terms of Jewish texts, those are things I read every day. Further to that, according to Torath Mosheh, knowledge of the relevant field is necessary means that you know the Talmud, you know Rav Saad Gaon, you know all the different texts that you see here and more. You can't be an expert if you don't interact with these texts every day as a part of the process of knowing what the text says. Further to that, according to Torath Mosheh, fluent in both source and target language means that you know what's called Lashon HaKodesh, you know Yehudith, you know Torah and Halacha, and you know Israeli and Jewish culture. Also, according to Torath Mosheh, to have knowledge of the relevant field is necessary means that you know the similarities and differences between Torath Mosheh Jews and Samaritans, Shomronim and Torath Mosheh Jews. So Torath Mosheh Jews, of course, as I've mentioned in other videos, is made up of different groups who hold by the Torah of the Jewish people. Where Samaritans, have their own Torah, and there's only about 1,000 of them left here in the land of Israel. So an expert would be necessary to know both sides of this, even if they don't agree with one side. You would at least have to know who they are and know what the similarities and differences are. It is for this reason that Torath Mosheh Jews teach Torath Mosheh children and adults to be experts in Torath Mosheh text in the languages they were originally written in. So what you see in this picture on the left side are a group of Yemenite children who are learning from Amore, and they're all learning from ancient Hebrew text, and they're learning how to read it and understand it, and they're starting off as kids, so that on the right side what you see is older men who are reading the same text, who grew up with it as kids and have become experts. Further to this point, at one point, there was a council known as the Council of Orthodox Jewish Scientists, and essentially, I found some documents of their proceedings that goes back to 1966. And what is interesting here is that there's an article in this particular document from Cyril Dome. He was a professor of theoretical physics in King's College, University of London, and honorary president of the Association of Orthodox Jewish Scientists of Great Britain. So he wrote an interesting article, and I'll just give an excerpt of part of what he wrote. And what he mentions here is the following: language. Let me start right at the beginning. I shall make a suggestion which seem to be logical, and shall then try to show how they are born out by traditional sources. Since the Tanakh and many major Jewish works are in Hebrew, it is common sense that the first thing one must do is learn the Hebrew language. This is precisely what the rabbis tell us to do. On the verse in the Shema, "V'lamartem otam et benechem ledaber bom." Besifrei states, partially quoted by Rashi, "Mekan amru shehatinok matchil ledaber aviv medaber imo b'lashon hakodesh v'lomdu Torah ואם אין מדבר עמו בלשון הקודש ואינו מלמדו תורה כאילו קברו." The first task of the father is to speak it to his child in Hebrew and to teach him the Torah. And if he does not do this, it is as if he has buried him, because he fails to give him the key to the traditional sources, which are the lifeblood of the Jewish studies. A knowledge of the Lashon HaKodesh precedes and is an essential requisite to limud Torah, the learning of the Torah. So further to this isn't just me making this up. And that's one thing I've run into people who try to say as if I'm making up stuff by saying that the Hebrew language is important. This goes back to ancient times, more than 2,000 years ago, of saying that it is a requirement to teach the children of Israel Torah, in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, and to teach them first. This is one of the reasons that a basic principle learning the Torah was twice in Hebrew, once in translation, the translation being Aramaic. So to end off, essentially what this means is that when Jews have a question about the Torah, we have leaders that we can go to, who have gone through the process I mentioned before and are experts in these different areas. It doesn't mean that one rabbi is an expert in everything. It means that there are different rabbis who have different specialties and different areas of study that make them an expert in those areas. So you may have one rabbi who's a doctor, who's an expert in doctors. Just like I mentioned before, there's rabbis who are experts in physics. You have a number of rabbis who are scientists. You have a number of rabbis who are, in terms of judicial law, understand that, politics, things like that. And there's a requirement for the Jewish people to also be experts in the Torah and not just have our rabbis be the experts. One of the goals of any rabbi would be that his students would be, further along than him, and that there's a principle that's mentioned, I think in the Talmud, where basically a leader of the Jewish people should always be willing to learn from his students, that he should be teaching them as well as learning from them in the process of teaching. So this is an important element of the idea that, for example, the Torah is not something that we just pick up and study once and be done with it and say, I've read my paper, I'm done, but that at every moment in time, it's as if a Jewish person is learning Torah in order to write another paper about Torah, and every moment is another chance to, like, for example, teach another element of Torah and learn another element of Torah. So this is what it takes to be an expert in the Torah. And that's where if someone says, okay, well, like someone brought it to me recently, there are PhDs who would disagree with me. Well, that's perfectly fine. They can come down and, come to my videos and tell me where they disagree and prove what they're saying to be true. At the same time, there are a lot of PhDs out there who are not the type of people who would tell you, oh, I know this for a fact, for example, if it's an area where it's questionable. Or there are certain areas where they have their own theories that are just their theories. And in terms of translation, again, as a Torath Mosheh Jew, there's no reason for me to rely on a translation. And that's why I always tell people, if you want to come to me with an idea, come with me in the Hebrew language. There's no reason for you to come in translation because I don't read translations. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care. Bye.